My daughter mocked me when I was broke. Now I own a mansion, and she wants it for her kids. The alarm clock shrieked at 4:30 a.m., just like it had every morning for the past 3 years. Margaret's eyes snapped open, her body already conditioned to the relentless routine that had become her life. The small apartment was still dark, the thin walls doing little to muffle the sounds of her neighbors starting their own early morning rituals. She rolled out of bed, her joints protesting after another night of restless sleep on the worn-out mattress she couldn't afford to replace. Another day in paradise, she whispered to herself, a bitter smile crossing her face as she shuffled toward the bathroom. The mirror reflected back a woman who looked far older than her 42 years. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her once vibrant brown hair hung limp around her shoulders. The stress of juggling 3 jobs and mounting debt had taken its toll, etching lines of worry deep into her face. Margaret had become a master of silent mornings. She moved through her routine like a ghost, careful not to wake her 17-year-old daughter, Emma, who slept in the bedroom they shared. The living room couch had become Margaret's bed 2 years ago when they'd been forced to downsize from their modest 2-bedroom apartment. Every piece of furniture, every possession had been carefully calculated for maximum necessity and minimum cost. As she prepared for her first job of the day, cleaning offices downtown, Margaret's mind wandered to the stack of bills waiting on the kitchen counter. The red "Final Notice" stamps seemed to mock her every morning. Rent was due in 5 days, and she was still $400 short. The electricity bill had been marked for disconnection twice already this month, saved only by her pleading phone calls promising payment within 48 hours. The coffee maker gurgled to life, one of the few luxuries she hadn't been able to sacrifice. The cheap instant coffee tasted like cardboard, but it was fuel for the 18-hour days that had become her norm. She worked the morning shift at the office cleaning company, spent afternoons stocking shelves at the local grocery store, and finished her evenings serving tables at a diner that stayed open until midnight. "Mom, is that you making all that noise?" Emma's voice drifted from the bedroom, thick with sleep and irritation. "Sorry, sweetheart. Go back to sleep," Margaret called softly, guilt twisting in her stomach. Even her attempts to be quiet weren't good enough. 20 minutes later, as Margaret was gathering her cleaning supplies, Emma emerged from the bedroom in her pajamas, her long blonde hair messy from sleep. At 17, she was beautiful in the way that only teenagers could be, all potential and promise, with her whole life stretching ahead of her. But her expression was already hardened with the disappointment that had become her default when looking at her mother. "There's no milk again," Emma announced, standing in front of the open refrigerator. "And we're out of the good cereal. There's just that generic stuff that tastes like cardboard." Margaret's hands stilled on her cleaning bucket. "I'll pick some up after work today. I get paid from the diner tonight." "You always say that." Emma's voice carried the sharp edge of accumulated frustration. "Do you know what it's like being the only kid at school who can't afford to buy lunch? Who has to wear the same 3 outfits in rotation because her mom can't manage to provide basic necessities?" The words hit Margaret like physical blows. She'd heard variations of this speech hundreds of times, but it never got easier. "Emma, I'm doing the best I can. You know that." "Are you though?" Emma's green eyes flashed with a cruelty that only teenagers could muster. "Because Sarah's mom works one job, and they live in a house with a pool. They go on vacations. They have a car that doesn't break down every other week." Margaret felt her chest tighten. The comparison to other families was a daily torture. Sarah's mom has a college degree and what? You're just going to make excuses forever? Emma's voice rose, her frustration spilling over. "God, Mom, sometimes I'm so embarrassed to be your daughter. My friends' parents have real careers, real money. They live in nice houses and can afford to buy their kids decent clothes. And here you are, a 42-year-old woman who cleans toilets for a living." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret stood frozen, her cleaning supplies clutched in her hands, watching as her daughter's words settled between them like a poison that couldn't be taken back. Emma's face showed a flicker of regret, but the damage was done. "I dream about having a real home," Emma continued, her voice quieter now but no less cutting. A place where I wouldn't be ashamed to bring friends over, where we could have nice things and not worry about every penny. But look at us. Look at this place. She gestured around the cramped apartment with its mismatched furniture and water stains on the ceiling. You talk about working hard, but what do you have to show for it? We're still broke, still struggling, still living like this. Margaret's throat felt raw, as if she'd been screaming, though she hadn't said a word. One day, Emma. One day things will be different. Emma let out a harsh laugh that sounded far too old for her 17 years. One day? You've been saying that for years, Mom. Face it, this is our life. This is all we're ever going to have. You're never going to own a mansion or live like rich people. You're never going to be anything more than what you are right now. The words hung in the air like a curse. Margaret felt something break inside her chest, a small, hopeful part of her that had been holding on to dreams of a better future. Emma grabbed her backpack and headed for the door, pausing only to deliver one final blow. I just wish I had a mother who could actually provide for her family instead of just making empty promises about how things are going to get better. The door slammed shut, leaving Margaret alone with the echo of her daughter's words and the bitter taste of her own failures. She stood there for a long moment, her reflection caught in the dark window. The woman staring back at her looked defeated, broken down by years of struggle and her own daughter's contempt. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the pain and humiliation, something else began to stir. A small flame of determination that Emma's words had inadvertently ignited. Margaret straightened her shoulders and picked up her cleaning supplies. One day, she whispered to her reflection, and for the first time in months, she meant it. As she walked to the bus stop in the pre-dawn darkness, Margaret's mind began to work differently. The hurt from Emma's words was still there, sharp and immediate, but it was being transformed into something else. Something harder. Something that might just be strong enough to change everything. The bus arrived with a wheeze of brakes and a cloud of exhaust. Margaret climbed aboard, paid her fare with exact change, and took her usual seat in the back. Around her, other early morning workers dozed or stared out the windows, all of them caught in their own struggles, their own dreams deferred. But Margaret wasn't thinking about them. She was thinking about mansions and dreams, about the look in Emma's eyes when she delivered her crushing verdict. She was thinking about proving her wrong, about the day when Emma would see what her mother was truly capable of. The bus pulled away from the curb, carrying Margaret toward another day of thankless work and impossible dreams. But for the first time in years, those dreams didn't feel quite so impossible anymore. 5 years later, Margaret stood in the marble-floored foyer of her new mansion, sunlight streaming through the crystal chandelier and casting rainbow patterns across the pristine white walls. The silence was different here, not the oppressive quiet of poverty, but the peaceful hush of success. She ran her fingers along the smooth banister of the grand staircase, still hardly believing this was real. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had taken every ounce of determination that Emma's cruel words had awakened in her that morning 5 years ago. Margaret's hands, once raw from cleaning chemicals, now bore the subtle calluses of someone who had clawed her way up from nothing through sheer force of will. It started with the late-night hours after her diner shift ended. While the city slept, Margaret had taught herself web design, using the public library's computers. She'd watched YouTube tutorials until her eyes burned, practiced coding until her fingers moved automatically across the keyboard. The other cleaning ladies thought she was crazy, working 4 jobs instead of 3, but Margaret had stopped caring what anyone thought. "You're going to finish yourself," her supervisor at the cleaning company had warned when Margaret started falling asleep during her morning shifts. But Margaret had just smiled and pushed through, fueled by the memory of Emma's disgusted face and the promise she'd made to herself in that dark apartment. The breakthrough came when Margaret designed a website for the small accounting firm where she cleaned offices. The owner, impressed by her work, recommended her to a friend who needed an e-commerce site. Word spread slowly at first, then faster. Margaret's evenings became a blur of client meetings, code, and coffee. She reinvested every penny back into her business, buying better equipment, taking online courses, building a portfolio that gleamed with professional success. Within 2 years, She'd quit all her other jobs. Her web design company, Phoenix Digital, had 15 employees and clients across 3 states. The name felt appropriate. She'd risen from the ashes of her old life like a mythical bird, transformed by fire into something entirely new. The real estate agent had been skeptical when Margaret first walked into the upscale office wearing her best dress, a modest black number that cost more than she used to make in a month, but still felt inadequate among the luxury she now inhabited. "I'm looking for something special," she'd said, her voice steady despite the surreal nature of the moment. "A mansion. Something that says I've made it." And she had made it. The numbers in her bank account still felt surreal. The house cost more than she'd earned in her entire previous life combined, but the mortgage payments were manageable now. More than manageable, they were barely a blip in her monthly budget. Margaret walked through the house slowly, savoring each room. The kitchen was a chef's dream with granite countertops and professional-grade appliances. The living room could have fit her entire old apartment twice over. 5 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a library, a home office that was larger than most people's entire homes. The backyard featured a pool, a garden, and a view of the city skyline that took her breath away. She paused in what would have been Emma's room. Had things been different? The girl, now a woman of 22, hadn't spoken to her mother in 3 years. The last conversation had been a brief, awkward phone call where Emma had mentioned dropping out of college and moving in with her boyfriend. Margaret had offered to help, but Emma had hung up before she could finish the sentence. The silence in the house wasn't entirely peaceful, Margaret realized. It was also lonely. Success had a price, and hers had been measured in missed connections and relationships that had withered under the intensity of her drive. She'd gained a mansion but lost her daughter somewhere along the way. Margaret found herself in the master bedroom, standing before the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. Somewhere out there, Emma was living her own life, probably still believing her mother was the same broken woman who'd cleaned toilets and counted pennies. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd achieved everything Emma had once mocked her for never being able to reach, but there was no one to share it with. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to Emma's contact. Her finger hovered over the call button for a long moment before she set the phone aside. Some conversations required more than a phone call. Some required the right moment, the right circumstances. Margaret had learned patience during her climb to success. She'd learned that timing was everything, that some victories were worth waiting for. As she stood in her mansion, surrounded by the proof of her transformation, she knew that moment with Emma would come. She just had to wait for her daughter to make the first move. The doorbell's melodic chime echoed through the mansion on a Tuesday morning in October, its elegant sound a far cry from the harsh buzzer of Margaret's old apartment. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her housekeeper came on Thursdays, and business meetings were always scheduled in advance. Margaret set down her coffee cup and walked across the marble foyer, her silk slippers whispering against the polished stone. Through the ornate glass panels beside the front door, she could see a familiar silhouette. Her breath caught in her throat. Even after 3 years of silence, she would recognize that posture anywhere. The way Emma held her left shoulder slightly higher when she was nervous, the fidgeting with her hair when she was unsure of herself. Margaret's hand trembled as she reached for the handle. Time seemed to slow as she opened the door, revealing the young woman who had once been her whole world. Emma stood on the marble steps, looking older than her 22 years. Her once vibrant blonde hair was now pulled back in a tired ponytail, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. She wore a worn denim jacket over a faded t-shirt, and her jeans had seen better days. "Mom," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. The word hung between them like a bridge. Neither was sure could hold their weight.
"Emma."
Margaret's voice was steadier than she felt. "This is unexpected." For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Margaret took in the changes in her daughter's appearance, the way her clothes hung loose on her frame, the exhaustion etched into her young face, the absence of the defiant fire that had once burned so bright in her eyes. Emma's gaze, meanwhile, was traveling past Margaret into the house, her expression shifting from uncertainty to something closer to shock. Emma started, then stopped, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "I didn't know you lived here." Margaret stepped aside, gesturing for Emma to enter. "Come in, please." Emma crossed the threshold hesitantly, as if she were entering a sacred space she had no right to disturb. Her sneakers squeaked softly against the marble as she turned in a slow circle, taking in the chandelier, the sweeping staircase, the artwork that adorned the walls. Her eyes were wide with disbelief. "Mom, this place is..." She trailed off, unable to find words. "Different from the apartment," Margaret finished. "Yes, it is." They moved into the living room, where Emma continued her stunned survey of the space. She ran her fingers along the back of the ivory leather sofa, stared up at the coffered ceiling, and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the manicured gardens. "I don't understand," Emma said finally, turning to face her mother. When did you?" She gestured helplessly at the opulent surroundings. Margaret settled into one of the armchairs, studying her daughter's face. "I started a business. Web design. It did well." "Web design." Emma's voice was faint. "But you cleaned offices." "I was a lot of things," Margaret said quietly. "I adapted." Emma sank onto the sofa, as if her legs could no longer support her. "This is insane. This whole house is bigger than everywhere I've ever lived combined." She looked around again, shaking her head. "You actually did it. You actually became successful." The admission seemed to cost her something. Margaret watched as emotions flickered across her daughter's face, surprise, confusion, and something that might have been regret. "Why are you here, Emma?" Margaret asked gently. "After 3 years of silence, why now?" Emma's composure cracked slightly. She pressed her lips together, looking down at her hands. "I've been thinking about you lately. About us. About things I said when I was younger and stupid. You were 17. And hurting. I was cruel." Emma's voice was thick with emotion. "I said terrible things to you when you were already struggling. I called you a failure, said you'd never amount to anything. And now..." She gestured around the room. "Now I'm sitting in your mansion, realizing just how wrong I was." Margaret felt a complex mix of emotions, vindication, sadness, and something that might have been hope. "People change, Emma. We both have." "Yeah, we have." Emma's laugh was bitter. "You became successful and wealthy, and I..." She stopped, seeming to realize she was revealing more than she intended. "And you..." Emma was quiet for a long moment, her fingers twisting in her lap. "I'm struggling, Mom. Really struggling. Jake and I broke up 6 months ago, and I've been trying to make it on my own, but..." She took a shaky breath. "I have 2 kids now. Lily is 3, and Mason just turned 1. Their father isn't in the picture, and I'm working 2 jobs just to keep us afloat. Some days I feel like I'm drowning." Margaret felt her heart clench. "You have children?" "Yeah." Emma's smile was watery. "They're beautiful, Mom. They're everything to me. But I'm so tired all the time, and I can barely afford daycare, and I look at them, and I wonder if I'm going to fail them the way I thought you failed me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with years of regret and the weight of coming full circle. Margaret saw herself in Emma's exhausted posture, recognized the desperation she'd once felt so keenly. But she also saw something else, an opportunity for redemption, for both of them. "I'd like to meet them," Margaret said softly. "My grandchildren." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I'd like that too. I've wanted to call you so many times, but I was ashamed. Ashamed of how I treated you, ashamed of how my life turned out." She looked around the mansion again. "I guess I was also afraid of this, of seeing how much better your life became after I left." Margaret leaned forward, her heart breaking for the young woman who had once been her little girl. "Emma, you could never be a failure to me. You're my daughter." Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I know this is a lot to ask, but I was wondering if maybe we could start over? I want my kids to know their grandmother. I want them to have what I threw away." Margaret nodded, feeling tears of her own threatening. "I'd like that very much." But even as she spoke the words, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Emma's visit than a simple desire to reconnect. The way her daughter's eyes kept surveying the house, the calculating look that flickered across her face when she thought Margaret wasn't watching, it reminded her of something. Something that made her heart sink even as she hoped for reconciliation. It reminded her of the old Emma, the one who had always wanted more than what she had. 3 weeks later, Emma had become a regular fixture in Margaret's life. She visited twice a week, bringing her children, Lily, a precocious 3-year-old with Emma's green eyes, and Mason, a chubby-cheeked toddler who gurgled happily in his grandmother's arms. Margaret had purchased a swing set for the backyard and filled one of the spare bedrooms with toys. For the first time in years, the mansion felt truly alive. Margaret treasured these visits, watching as Lily ran through the halls with boundless energy and Mason took his first tentative steps on the polished marble floors. But she also noticed things that made her uneasy. The way Emma's eyes lingered on the artwork, how she asked casual questions about the cost of renovations, her comments about how impractical such a large house was for just one person. On this particular afternoon, Emma had arrived looking more worn down than usual. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her shoulders sagged with exhaustion. The children were napping in the living room, Lily curled up on the massive sectional sofa, while Mason dozed in his stroller. The daycare raised their rates again, Emma said, settling into the chair across from Margaret. $200 more a month. I don't know how I'm going to manage it. Margaret sipped her tea, studying her daughter's face. Have you looked into other options? Mom, there are no other options. Not good ones, anyway. Emma's voice carried a sharp edge of frustration. Do you know what it's like trying to balance everything? I work at the grocery store during the day, then wait tables at night. I barely see my kids except to put them to bed. And for what? So I can afford a 1-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood where I'm afraid to let Lily play outside. It's hard, Margaret acknowledged. I remember those days. Emma let out a bitter laugh. Do you? Because looking around this place, it's hard to believe you were ever where I am now. She gestured at the opulent surroundings. This house is like something out of a magazine. The kitchen alone is bigger than my entire apartment. Margaret set down her teacup carefully. Emma, what is it you're really trying to say? For a moment, Emma looked like she might deflect, but then her composure cracked. I'm drowning, Mom. I'm 22 years old with 2 kids and no help. Their father disappeared the moment he found out about Mason. I'm working myself to death just to keep us afloat, and I'm terrified that I'm going to mess up my kids the way I thought you messed up with me. Tears started rolling down Emma's cheeks. I lie awake at night wondering if they'll grow up resenting me for not being able to give them more. If they'll look at me the way I looked at you and think I'm a failure. I can't bear the thought of hearing those words come out of Lily's mouth someday. Margaret's heart ached for her daughter, but something in Emma's tone warned her that this conversation was heading somewhere she wouldn't like. I've been thinking, Emma continued, wiping her eyes, about this house, about how much space you have here and how little space we have where we are. And I keep coming back to the same thought. What if this could be the solution for all of us? What do you mean? Emma took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. I mean, Mom, you're living alone in a mansion. You have 5 bedrooms and you use 1. You have this huge backyard, this beautiful kitchen, all these spaces that are just empty. And meanwhile, your grandchildren are growing up in a cramped apartment where they can't even have their own rooms. Margaret felt a chill creep up her spine. Emma? Just hear me out, Emma said quickly. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a chance to give my kids the childhood they deserve. This house, it's not just a house, Mom. It's a legacy. It's security. It's everything I want for Lily and Mason. The room fell silent except for the soft sounds of the children sleeping. Margaret stared at her daughter, seeing the desperation in her eyes, but also something else, a familiar entitlement that made her stomach turn. Are you asking me to give you my house? Margaret asked quietly. I'm asking you to think about what's really important, Emma said, her voice gaining strength. You've proven your point. You've shown the world that you could succeed. But what's the point of all this success if you're not using it to help your family? Margaret felt as if she'd been slapped. Help my family? Yes. Look at what you could do for your grandchildren. They could grow up here, in this beautiful house, with all the advantages you never had. They could have their own rooms, their own space to play and grow. They could go to the best schools, have the best opportunities. Emma leaned forward, her eyes bright with desperate hope. And you wouldn't be alone anymore. We could be a family again, Mom. A real family. The kids would have their grandmother, and you'd have us. Isn't that worth more than living in this empty mansion by yourself? Margaret's mind raced. The request was so audacious, so presumptuous, that she almost couldn't believe Emma was serious. But looking at her daughter's face, she saw the same expression Emma had worn as a teenager when she demanded things they couldn't afford, the same mix of entitlement and desperation that had once driven her to mock her mother's poverty. "You want me to give you my house," Margaret repeated, her voice flat. "I want you to think about your grandchildren's future," Emma said, but there was something desperate in her tone now. "This house is too big for one person anyway. And at your age, do you really need all this space? Wouldn't it be better to know that it's being used to give your family a better life?" The words hung in the air between them, and Margaret felt the last of her hope for genuine reconciliation crumble. Emma hadn't come back to reconnect with her mother. She hadn't come back out of love or regret or a desire to heal their relationship. She'd come back because she'd learned about the mansion and seen an opportunity. "At my age?" Margaret asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Emma seemed to realize she'd overstepped. "I just meant that you've already accomplished so much. You don't need to prove anything anymore. But my kids, they're just starting their lives. They have their whole futures ahead of them." Margaret stood slowly, her legs feeling unsteady. Looking down at her daughter, she saw not the remorseful young woman who had appeared at her door 3 weeks ago, but the same selfish girl who had once told her she'd never amount to anything. The girl who had measured her mother's worth in dollars and possessions, who had mocked her dreams and called her a failure. "Get out," Margaret said softly. "Mom, please just think about it. Get out of my house." Margaret's voice was stronger now, filled with a cold fury that made Emma's eyes widen. "Wake up your children and leave. Now." Emma stood, her face pale with shock. "Mom, I think you're misunderstanding." "I understand perfectly," Margaret said, her voice cutting through Emma's protests like a blade. "You came here because you heard about my success, and you thought you could manipulate me into giving you everything I worked for. You thought you could use my grandchildren as leverage to get what you want." "That's not true." Emma's voice cracked. "I love you, Mom. I want us to be a family." "No," Margaret said, her heart breaking even as her resolve hardened. "You want my house. There's a difference." Emma stared at her mother, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled for words. Then, slowly, her expression shifted from shock to something harder, more familiar. The mask of vulnerability slipped away, revealing the entitled young woman underneath. "Fine," Emma said, her voice cold. "Keep your precious mansion. But don't expect me to feel sorry for you when you're old and alone in this empty house, with nothing but your money for company." She moved toward the sleeping children, her movements sharp with anger. As she gathered Mason from his stroller and gently shook Lily awake, Margaret felt the weight of her decision settling on her shoulders. But she also felt something else, a fierce pride in the woman she'd become, and a determination to protect what she'd built from those who would take it from her, even if one of them was her own daughter. Emma didn't leave immediately. Instead, she stood in the center of the living room, holding Mason against her hip while Lily rubbed her sleepy eyes and clung to her mother's leg. The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of unspoken resentment and fresh betrayal. "You know what?" Emma said finally, her voice shaking with anger. "I shouldn't be surprised. This is exactly who you've always been, selfish and bitter." Margaret felt something snap inside her chest. "Selfish? I'm selfish." "Yes." Emma's voice rose, causing Lily to look up with wide, confused eyes. "You're sitting here in your palace, hoarding your wealth, while your own grandchildren struggle in poverty. What kind of person does that?" "The kind of person who remembers being told she was a failure," Margaret shot back, her composure finally cracking. The kind of person who remembers her own daughter being ashamed of her for not being able to afford nice things. Emma's face flushed red. I was 17. Kids say stupid things when they're upset. Do they? Margaret's voice was ice cold. Because you seem to be saying the same stupid things now. You're 22, Emma. You're a mother. And you're still the same entitled little girl who thought the world owed her something. I'm not entitled. I'm desperate. Emma's voice cracked. Do you know what it's like to watch your children go without? To know that you can't give them the life they deserve. Margaret stared at her daughter, seeing her younger self in Emma's desperation, but also seeing the crucial difference. Yes, I do know what that's like. I lived it for years. But do you know what I didn't do? I didn't expect someone else to solve my problems for me. That's not what I'm doing. Isn't it? Margaret's voice cut through Emma's protest. You disappeared from my life for 3 years. 3 years, Emma. No calls, no visits, no concern for how I was doing. And then you show up here, butter me up with visits, and let me bond with my grandchildren, all so you could work up to asking for my house. Emma's jaw tightened. I came here because I missed you. Did you? Or did you come here because you heard through the grapevine that your failure of a mother had somehow managed to become successful? Margaret took a step closer, her eyes blazing. Tell me, Emma, when exactly did you find out about this house? When did you learn that your pathetic mother had actually made something of herself? Emma's silence was answer enough. I thought so. Margaret's laugh was bitter. You know what the really tragic part is? I would have helped you. If you had come to me honestly as my daughter and asked for help with your children, I would have said yes. I would have paid for daycare, helped with rent, made sure my grandchildren had everything they needed. Then why won't you do it now? Emma demanded. Because you didn't ask for help, Margaret said, her voice deadly quiet. You asked for my house. You looked at everything I've built, everything I've sacrificed for, and decided it should be yours. Just like you always did. Emma shifted Mason to her other hip, her face twisted with frustration. God, Mom, listen to yourself. You're talking about this house like it's some kind of sacred monument. It's just a building. Just a building? Margaret's voice rose for the first time. This house represents 20 years of 18-hour days. It represents every night I fell asleep on the couch because I couldn't afford a bigger apartment. It represents every time you made me feel like I was worthless because I couldn't give you what you wanted. Tears were streaming down Margaret's face now, but her voice remained strong. This house is proof that I was never the failure you said I was. It's proof that all those years of struggling weren't for nothing. And you think I should just hand it over to you because you've decided you deserve it. I deserve it because I'm your daughter. Emma screamed, causing both children to start crying. Because these are your grandchildren. Family is supposed to help family. Family? Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. Where's my family when I was working 3 jobs and falling asleep standing up? Where was my family when I was eating ramen noodles for dinner so you could have real food? Where was my family when I was crying myself to sleep because my own daughter was ashamed of me? Emma's face crumpled. I was just a kid. And I was just a mother trying to survive. Margaret's voice cracked. But you know what? I did more than survive. I thrived. I built something incredible from nothing, and I did it without anyone's help. Certainly not yours. So that's it. Emma's voice was shaking. You're going to punish me forever for things I said when I was 17? Margaret wiped her eyes, her resolve hardening. I'm not punishing you, Emma. I'm protecting myself. And I'm protecting what I've built from someone who sees it as something they're entitled to rather than something that was earned. Emma stared at her mother for a long moment, then let out a harsh laugh. You know what's funny? I used to think you were weak. I used to think you were pathetic and powerless. But you're not weak at all, are you? You're just cruel. If protecting what's mine makes me cruel, then I'll accept that, Margaret said quietly. Emma gathered the diaper bag and started walking toward the door, bouncing Mason to quiet his crying while Lily trailed behind, still confused and upset. At the threshold, she turned back one last time. "I hope your mansion keeps you warm at night," she said, her voice cold and final. "Because it's all you're going to have. Don't expect to hear from me again. And don't expect to see your grandchildren. You've made your choice." Margaret watched as her daughters strapped the children into their car seats, her heart breaking with each movement. Part of her wanted to run after Emma, to call her back and promise to give her anything she wanted. But the stronger part of her, the part that had been forged in the fire of struggle and hardship, held her ground. The car pulled away from the circular driveway, leaving Margaret standing alone in the doorway of her beautiful, empty house. She closed the door slowly, the sound echoing through the marble foyer like a final judgment. For a long moment, she stood there listening to the silence. Then, slowly, she walked back to the living room where the children's toys still lay scattered on the floor. She picked up a stuffed elephant that Lily had been playing with, holding it against her chest as the tears finally came. But even through her grief, Margaret felt something she hadn't expected: relief. She had stood her ground. She had refused to be manipulated or guilted into giving away what she had earned. For the first time in her life, she had chosen herself. The house might be empty, but Margaret realized she wasn't. She was full of the strength she had built over decades of struggle, full of the pride that came from achieving the impossible, full of the knowledge that she had become exactly who she needed to be. Emma had been wrong about one thing: the mansion wouldn't keep her warm at night. But the knowledge that she had earned every inch of it, that she had proven every doubter wrong, that she had become someone worthy of respect, that would keep her warm for the rest of her life. 6 months had passed since Emma's final departure, and Margaret had learned to navigate the silence differently. The mansion no longer felt like a monument to loneliness, but rather a sanctuary of her own making. She had removed the children's toys from the spare bedroom, but kept the swing set in the backyard. Not out of hope, but as a reminder of the choice she had made and why it had been necessary. On this particular evening, Margaret sat at her home office, reviewing the quarterly reports for Phoenix Digital. Her company had expanded again, now employing over 50 people across 4 states. The irony wasn't lost on her. While her personal life had contracted, her professional world had continued to grow. Success, she had learned, was not always measured in the warmth of family gatherings. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Margaret glanced at the clock, 7:30 p.m., too late for business calls or deliveries. She made her way to the front door, her footsteps echoing in the foyer. Through the glass panels, she could see a figure silhouetted against the porch light, smaller than Emma, unfamiliar yet somehow recognizable. Margaret opened the door to find a young woman in her early 20s, with nervous eyes and an uncertain smile. She was holding a manila envelope and shifting her weight from foot to foot. "Mrs. Davidson?" the woman asked tentatively. "I'm Sarah Chen. I worked with Emma at the grocery store." Margaret's heart skipped. Is everything all right?" "She's fine physically," Sarah said quickly. "But I wanted to talk to you about something. Emma doesn't know I'm here, and she'd probably be furious if she found out, but I felt like someone needed to tell you the truth." Margaret stepped aside, gesturing for Sarah to enter. They settled in the living room, where Sarah perched nervously on the edge of the sofa. "Emma talks about you sometimes," Sarah began. "Not often, but when she does, it's complicated. She's angry, but she's also proud. She brags about your success to anyone who'll listen, but then she gets this look in her eyes, like she's remembering something painful." Margaret remained silent, letting Sarah continue. "The thing is," Sarah said, pulling a folded paper from the envelope, "Emma's been lying to you. About her situation, about why she came to see you." She handed Margaret the paper, a bank statement with Emma's name on it. "She's not as desperate as she made herself seem." Margaret studied the document, her eyebrows rising. The account showed a substantial balance, far more than someone working 2 minimum-wage jobs should have. "Jake, her ex-boyfriend, he's not just some deadbeat who disappeared," Sarah continued. "He's actually a successful contractor, and he's been paying generous child support. Emma also inherited money from her grandmother on her father's side last year. She's not wealthy, but she's comfortable. Certainly comfortable enough to afford a decent apartment and good childcare." Margaret felt a complex mix of emotions wash over her. Relief that her grandchildren weren't suffering, anger at being manipulated, but also something deeper, a recognition of her own wisdom in trusting her instincts. "Why are you telling me this?" Margaret asked. Sarah looked uncomfortable. "Because I watched my own grandmother give up everything to help family members who kept taking advantage of her. She died alone and broke, surrounded by people who only loved what she could give them." She paused, then added softly, "And because I think Emma needs to learn that actions have consequences. She's been getting by on her looks and her ability to make people feel sorry for her for too long." After Sarah left, Margaret sat in her living room, processing this new information. She wasn't surprised. Some part of her had suspected Emma's desperation was performed rather than genuine. But having it confirmed brought a different kind of peace. She walked upstairs to her bedroom and stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Emma was living her life, probably telling people about her heartless mother who had chosen money over family. And maybe, to some people, that's exactly what it would look like. But Margaret knew the truth. She had chosen self-respect over manipulation. She had chosen to honor her own journey rather than diminish it for someone else's comfort. She had chosen to be the woman she had fought so hard to become. The bitterness she had carried for so long was finally beginning to fade. Emma's words from their teenage years no longer held the same power. The woman who had once been told she would never amount to anything was now standing in her own mansion, running a successful business, and finally understanding her own worth. Margaret thought about the young woman she had been, exhausted, defeated, mocked by her own daughter. That woman had dreamed of proving everyone wrong, of achieving success despite the odds. But she had also dreamed of recognition, of apology, of validation from those who had hurt her. Now, Margaret understood that the validation she had been seeking had always been within her grasp. She didn't need Emma's approval to know she had succeeded. She didn't need anyone's permission to be proud of what she had built. The mansion around her wasn't just a house. It was a testament to resilience, to the power of refusing to accept other people's limitations as your own truth. Every room represented a choice to keep going when giving up would have been easier. Every luxury was a reminder that she had earned the right to comfort and beauty. Margaret smiled as she looked at her reflection in the window. The woman staring back at her was older now, marked by years of struggle and triumph. But she was also stronger, wiser, and finally, truly free. She had learned that some relationships were built on love and respect, while others were built on need and manipulation. She had learned that family wasn't just about blood ties, but about mutual care and genuine connection. Most importantly, she had learned that her worth wasn't determined by her ability to meet other people's expectations, but by her commitment to honoring her own journey. The house was quiet around her, but it wasn't empty. It was full of her achievements, her memories, her dreams realized. And for the first time in her life, Margaret realized that was enough. She had become the woman she was meant to be, not despite her struggles, but because of them. Not in spite of Emma's rejection, but strengthened by her own ability to stand firm in her convictions. The mansion would always be there, a monument to what was possible when someone refused to accept defeat. But the real victory wasn't in the marble floors or crystal chandeliers. It was in the knowledge that Margaret Davidson had proven the most important person wrong, herself, all those years ago, when she had almost believed she would never amount to anything. Now she knew better. Now she knew exactly what she was worth.